Now we continue with Alternate 1985, and Matthew talks about the Biff in Alternate 1985. This portrayal of Biff completely disarms the idea of Biff in the first place. In the first film, Biff was a person, and there was an idea behind his character. Biff was a coward. The only thing that made him formidable was his size. He was hoping that his being big would prevent anyone from standing up against him, and as soon as someone did, he retreated into his natural state of coward. So the idea that even after he learned this lesson he became a supervillain detracts from the substance of the character. Just a side note, Matthew, a supervillain is a villain with superpowers. Biff doesn't have superpowers. But more importantly, I don't know where you've got this idea that Biff only pushed people around in the first film because of his size, and that he stopped doing this as soon as someone stood up to him. That was never established in the first film, or indeed in the second film. It's true that George punches him, and back in 1985 he has turned into a diligent lackey for George, but that doesn't mean that the transformation happened instantly the moment George punched him, or that Biff didn't continue to push other people around. George punching Biff actually represents more of a change in George than it does in Biff. George now had the confidence to stand up to Biff, and he continued to do this over the course of the next 30 years, and as a result, Biff gradually changed into a nice guy. Now, of course, this is still the reality where George punches him, and therefore the reality where George had the confidence to stand up to him. But that's probably why Biff ultimately decided to murder him. The Biff we see in the alternate 1985 is in fact more consistent with the Biff we see in 1955 than the Biff we see at the end of the first film. This is actually one of the few things that I actually prefer about this film to the first one. There was really no explanation as to how Biff's transformation from bully to lackey comes about in the first film. However, in this film, Biff has clearly gone mad with power. He now has, with all his wealth, a madness which has caused him to become a murderer. We really didn't know that much about Biff in the first film. This film, however, focuses on him much more. If anything, he's more of a character in this film. We find out much more about him, as opposed to in the first film, when all we really knew about him was the way that he related to George and Lorraine. To George he was a bully, and to Lorraine he was just this guy who constantly harassed her. Brings me to your next point. The only idea they have for Biff in this film is that he's the bad guy, so he will do all the bad stuff. Biff doing stuff with no thought of the character or any kind of a story. Why is this Biff's movie anyway? This is Marty's story. Well, I don't really see what's wrong with having the bad guy do all the bad stuff. That just seems like common sense to me. There is most definitely a story here. Biff has gotten rich, gained power as a result, and turned Hill Valley into a horrible place. This is most definitely Biff's movie. But I think that's a good thing. Zemeckis and Gale clearly felt they had done everything they could with Marty in the first film, so they decided to concentrate on Biff in this film. And personally, I loved that. Biff is one of my all-time favourite movie antagonists, and it pained me that we didn't see a bit more of him in the first film. In this film, he's basically the main character for a large part of it, and being able to see more of him is one of the main reasons I love this film. The series is actually a bit of a trifecta in that sense. Each film focuses on a different character. The first film is Marty, the second film is Biff, and the third is Doc. Okay, so the Doc explains to Marty about how old Biff gave young Biff the almanac, and he's gotten richer as a result. Then Marty goes and asks 1985 Biff about when and where he got the almanac, and Matthew says this. Biff gives Marty a narrative account of exactly what Doc told Marty 2 minutes earlier. We've gotten the same information twice in a row. Well, neither of these scenes are particularly long, so it's not really a major problem. We are being told the story from two different perspectives, and Biff does give Marty a couple of new pieces of information. The date he got the book, and that he was told to kill anyone that asked about it. And that brings me on to Matthew's next point. Biff was just a bully in the first film. When did he become a natural-born killer? This wasn't even the mad, powerful Biff that gives this order. It was the old Biff from 2015. Biff became a natural-born killer when he became rich and went mad with power. There's also nothing to suggest that he wouldn't have been capable of killing someone in the first film if he thought he could get away with it. And regarding old Biff giving the order for Biff to kill someone, giving someone else an order to kill someone 30 years from now and actually killing a living, breathing person standing right in front of you are two very different things. Okay, so Marty and Doc go back to 1955 to fix the past, and Matthew makes this comment. Do they go back to 2015? No, they go back to 1955. They go back to a place we've already seen. When I first saw this film, I was thinking, no, go back to 2015, I don't even care what you do there. Back to 2015 would have been going back to a place we've already seen as well, so I don't really understand why you think going back to 2015 is okay, but going back to 1955 isn't. Also, I don't even care what you do there? Okay, so you've been criticising this film for having an incoherent plot, and now suddenly you don't care what they do? Make up your mind. But anyway, the doc explains quite clearly why they can't go back to 2015. If they go back there from alternate 1985, it will be the future of that reality where Biff is in power. So there's really no point to them going back to 2015. Okay, so now we get to the scene where Biff harasses Lorraine and asks her out to the dance, and Matthew makes this comment. Biff goes after Lorraine and yells at her, I'm going to marry you someday, Lorraine. Someday you'll be my wife. I felt this really detracted from Biff's character again. In the first film, I would have been surprised if Biff knew her name. He wanted to molest her, not whisper sweet nothings in her ear. He wasn't in love with her, he didn't want to marry her. Now you expect me to believe that Biff politely asked her to the dance. This scene is only for the sake of watching Biff do stuff. Well, you are correct that Biff was not in love with her, but there's never any indication from the way Biff behaves around Lorraine that he is in love with her. He tells her she should wear nothing at all, and he flat out tells her she is going to the dance with him. He never asks her to go to the dance with him. He wants to marry Lorraine is so he can have her all to himself. We see that quite clearly in the alternate 1985. He also never whispers sweet nothings in her ear. I don't understand where you've got that idea from, or even the idea that the way Biff asks her out to the dance was polite. The watching Biff do stuff, as you put it, is what I like to call character development. And like I said before, personally I love the fact we get to see a bit more of Biff in this film. Okay, so now we get to the scene with old Biff and young Biff in the car, where old Biff gives young Biff the almanac, and Matthew makes this comment. If you hear Doc say old Biff gave the book to his younger self, then you hear alternate 80s Biff say he got the book from his younger self, then you see old Biff give the book to his younger self, you are getting the same information. Well, once again, this scene is not particularly long, so it's really a very minor point. But we do see in this scene how old Biff was able to convince his younger self that the book really did predict the future by playing the ending of a football game on the radio. This scene also gives us a great demonstration of just how much of a jerk Biff really is. He's even a jerk towards himself. I also thought it was hilarious seeing young Biff's reaction to all this. He really didn't have a clue what was going on. So even though we already know most of the information in this scene, it still makes for an enjoyable scene. Like the scene in McFly's house, the scene is about enhancing the experience of the film, rather than giving us any new information or exposition. So now just another general comment from Matthew. There is no story here, it's just exposition. The whole film is almost entirely exposition. Every film needs exposition. I really don't understand how you can think that the film has a lot of exposition, but also say that there's no story. Again, that sounds like a contradiction of terms. There is most definitely a story here. It focuses on Biff's lust for power and the dangers of misusing time travel. Also, I really don't see how you can think that there's more exposition in this film than there was in the first film. In the first film, Lorraine explains in some detail how she and George met and fell in love. The Doc explains to Marty why his brother and his sister are disappearing from that photo, and what he must do to fix it. He explains in 3 separate scenes how he plans to send Marty back to 1985. And Marty and George discuss in some detail their plan for George to rescue Lorraine. Now, personally, none of this bothered me. I like to know what's going on when I watch a film. My point is, how can you have a problem with the exposition in this film when the last film had just as much, if not more, exposition? Okay, so now we move on to the Enchantment Under the Sea dance segment, which is obviously taken from the first film, and Matthew makes this comment. This is movie recycling. The whole third act is just the third act of the first film again. Zemeckis and Gale thought it would be neat to see the first film from a different angle. I don't know if it was neat as much as it was a boring retread. Well, the segment of the Enchantment Under the Sea dance is hardly a retread. Aside from the scene where George punches Biff and the scene where Marty is playing Johnny B. Good, everything we see here is new stuff we've not seen before. And even the scene where Marty's playing Johnny B. Good focuses on something else. It's also pretty unique. What other film sequel has ever done something like this? So continuing Matthew's comment about this being the same as the first film, this is only novel if you are watching it at its release in 1989. It only works once. 50 years from now, when people watch these films back to back, they will say, "Wait a minute, I just saw this a few hours ago." Well, I first watched these films back to back, and I actually thought going into the first film was pretty cool. But even if this idea does appeal more to a theatre audience than it does to a DVD audience, I don't really think there's anything wrong with that. For a film to even have a chance of being successful in DVD sales, let alone be watched by people 50 years from now, it first and foremost has to succeed at the box office. There were no DVDs back in 1989, and I don't know how much people watched film series back to back then, but certainly nothing like as much as they do today. Are you really suggesting that Zemeckis and Gale, when they were writing this film, should have been thinking about an audience watching the trilogy 50 years from now? Okay, so now Matthew moves on to talking about part 3. 3 was good because it returned to the roots of what made the first film great. Really? It takes place in 1885, focuses mainly on Dog, and it's a love story, which makes little to no reference to the effects of time travel. It also doesn't have Biff in it. If anything, it's the black sheep, and it has far less to do with Back to the Future. So now just a general comment about this film. This film was an incoherent mess. I'm not sure what was incoherent. They go to 2015, Biff steals the time machine and changes the past, so Marty and Doc have to go to 1955 to fix things. The basic plot is fairly straightforward. And now just a general comment about Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale. Zemeckis and Gale had a philosophy that with sequels, people want to see the same things done differently. Personally, I am insulted by that philosophy. I don't want to see the same things done differently. I want to see something new. Well, there is plenty of new stuff in this film. 2015, the hoverboard, more of a focus on the dangers of time travel, more of a focus on Biff, the DeLorean flies, and the story arc where Marty hates being called chicken. Things need to be kept somewhat the same when you make a sequel, so that we can tell that we are indeed watching a sequel and not a completely separate film. That's the mistake Part 3 made. Part 3 is good if you look at it as just a film on its own merit, but it's not nearly as good if you think of it as a Back to the Future film. Part 2, however, feels much more like a Back to the Future film. Both are good for different reasons, but as such a massive fan of the original, I prefer Part 2. And now another comment about Part 3. With the narrative they include in the third film, you could skip the second film entirely. Well, if you did that, you wouldn't understand the ending to the third film, where Marty decides not to race his truck, and therefore doesn't have his crash. Also, the fact that you can skip over a film is no reason why you should skip over it. By that logic, you should skip over Alien and go straight to Aliens. You really don't miss anything you need to know in order to understand Aliens, but you do miss the experience of a great film, and you would have less of a connection with the characters in the film. And so Matthew ends the review by saying, "May the Force be with you." Well, that's a quote from Star Wars, not Back to the Future. I assume you're aware of this, but I have to ask why exactly you decided to end a review of a Back to the Future film with a quote from Star Wars. That doesn't really make any kind of satirical sense.